I want to move on to some of the stuff that the conversations I was having about migration. I noted a little bit before. Are we moving on from the pandemic? Are we moving around after the pandemic? Whatever it is, residential mobility has changed in the pandemic era, says author Riordan Frost in in a white paper, and we're just reading a kind of brief summary from it. There's 5 ways that he really highlights here, and I'll go through. I'll go through all 5 of them and really persist on the last 2, I guess. So number 1 is there was a fleeting increase in moves after the onset of the pandemic that only briefly disrupted the long-term decline in household mobility. So, yeah, we moved a little more during the pandemic, but overall, people are moving less and less and less. These long-term and short-term trends. In March 2020, the number of people filing a temporary change of address requests increased by 200% compared to March 2029. That's a big jump, but it's actually there is a decline that continued after the pandemic, with the household mobility rate falling to a historically low rate of 8.2% in 2024. So there, it does seem like people are moving around less, and I'd wonder, and what we'll get into in a second, but how housing affordability feeds into this, and how I would argue economics would feed into this. If you're a little bit more secure in your job, you probably or that a job will be available for you if you move, then you're probably more willing to make a move. But that could be, who knows? Households are crossing state lines at pre-pandemic rates after a sharp during pandemic increase. That's aligned with that first point. And homeowners locked into low mortgage rates are staying put and dragging down homeowner mobility rates after a during pandemic spike. Yeah, that's also understood. We know how this lock-in effect has made home sales very low, and we'll get into the numbers behind those low home sales. But yeah, it affects mobility, of course. This is what I wanted to get into because it ties into some work from Cushman and Wakefield too. More people are moving to less dense communities, continuing a during pandemic trend. So this post-pandemic trend is towards less dense communities, and it was present actually, I would say, during the pandemic. So here's something. From the graph they provided here, it sure looks like this movement away from downtowns was present as early as 2010. The only clear flip-flop of trends I can see between pre and post-pandemic is in the non-metro area, where before the pandemic, people were moving away from non-metro areas, and now, after the pandemic, they really are there's a significant portion of people that are now moving into these non-metro areas. However, if you're talking about movements movements away from large metro areas, that was present in as early as 2010, where people were moving away. And this kind of surprised me because I remember post financial crisis, there was that narrative of, well, we're going back to the downtown, the revitalization of downtown, but it looks as if that may not have been as strong, at least in the way they record it here. And it may actually depend on how you define where the downtown is, because people are moving in, or they were moving into large metro density suburbs, and that has actually fallen off slightly in the recent future. But the real winner here is these large metro, lower density suburbs. So maybe not the immediate suburbs, but a ring kind of further from that. And I wonder if these are the ones. I don't think they're necessarily exurbs, where like the far flung up and coming towns. Like I would argue maybe like a Westfield or something like that.
See, I'd say Westfield's the lower density. So my question here is, I kind of agree with you of, well, let's use Indianapolis here as an example. Let's say kind of where we went to. So when we say the large metro and people are moving away from, we know for sure that in the CBD here in Indianapolis,
I would say under
we would know for sure that falls under here. But let's go
16th Street even.
And that's what I was gonna say. Okay, so how far do we do that? Is it 38th Street? Is it 16th Street? Is it 38th Street? Because then is that still considered your large metro, or is that large metro higher density suburbs? Because Indianapolis is a little bit different for those who aren't here.
Yeah.
Indianapolis went through this Unigov back in the 1970s. So Indianapolis proper is actually out where suburbs of Indianapolis used to be. So you hear Speedway, you hear Lawrence, you hear some of these towns like Nora being a neighborhood. Those used to be neighborhood suburbs of Indianapolis that in the 1970s.
And we always called it a suburb.
Yeah. And so in Indianapolis, those are now Indianapolis addresses, but as Indianapolis grew, those were originally suburbs. And so how far out is that really? And so do we consider Indianapolis up to 96th Street the large metro, or do we consider that area between 38th Street and 96 kind of the higher density suburb? Because like we own Solana in that area, and so that's an area that's kind of growing in that whole Keystone corridor. Is that suburbs or is that Metro Indy?
To me, that's suburbs. This is how I define it. Now, it's just how I grew up, and it's like I always understood that because that's the area that I grew up like blocks from Solana, but it's around like 86th Street, suburbs, and then but you cross 96th Street into Carmel which is its own kind of suburban community. Then I think you're getting into maybe a lower density suburb than that. So for me,
So then Indianapolis, are we saying township? So Center Township is Metro Indianapolis, and what they would call here, like Washington Township, Lawrence Township, Pike Township. Are we saying that that's low metro, higher density suburbs then?
No, I think that's large metro, high densities. Yeah, exactly. Large metro, high density suburbs, and then the lower density suburbs are outside of the county line.
And so that's anything Carmel, Westfield,
Fishers,
Avon, Brownsburg, Green.
And there should be another category beyond that, which is your Westfields, your Whitestown.
I would almost say those are smaller metro. Now they could be large, but I mean, for you, what's the difference where you would consider like a difference between a Westfield and like a Lafayette? Because Lafayette would definitely be smaller metro.
Yeah, for sure.
Bloomington would definitely be smaller metro. Mm-hmm. Where do you draw the line between like Westfield and that? Like I still kind of consider Westfield suburbs.
It needs to be a new category.
But Anderson, which I would say is almost as far away as Westfield is, but that's small metro.
Yeah, it's small metro. It's small metro. I love this conversation, by the way. I can get sidetracked, but when you're moving on from there, from like individuals, market, submarket, they also say that the Sun Belt remains dominant in regional migration, but they say also signs of a shift are emerging. This is, I think, maybe one of the most relevant and interesting from my perspective. They say that notable shifts took place in many states in the Midwest and Northeast, where outflows were either lower than they had been during the pandemic, and here's the map right here, or net outflows switched to net inflows, and this may be evidence of a coming shift in migration towards what they call snow belt states, but I just think it's maybe away from the South and into more northern states, specifically I think the Midwest and Northeast. I couldn't count out, this is why I mentioned housing affordability as a potential factor, and it could be. I also wonder if there's like a return to where you were born and the support of like the family structure that you have, maybe if you had family in the Midwest. And so it could be people that have migrated and are migrating back home. But largely, people are moving more into some of these states that are north of the Sun Belt. But the whole upshot is you look at these states, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, they're all seeing more migration compared to before the pandemic, and they probably will continue to see more migration after the pandemic, because that's what it was like before. If we're going to return to a normal, the normal is that people were moving into the South. However, the more interesting thing, the new kind of insight I think that this has, it kind of goes against the trend, is places like, well, even West Virginia, but Kentucky, Indiana, Missouri, Wisconsin, throw Wyoming in there. These are states in the north that they switched from outflows to inflows. So I think that that's a promising sign, and maybe a sign that will continue in the future. It's something different. It's definitely different from pre-pandemic, so we'll see if that continues. Now, to switch gears again,